Assalamu alaikum, you're watching Just Law, coming to you live from our studios in southwest London. I'm your host Saleh Ahmed, and as you know, in this program we discuss legal matters, and of course continuing from our show last week where we discussed Islamophobia and the effects on the Muslims and what the British government is doing in order to legislate certain issues, including the CTS, which is the Crime, Terrorism and Securities Bill. I have two people on the subject who are going to assist us. So I have Wajahat Sharif, who is a criminal solicitor dealing with terrorism and related matters. Assalamu alaikum. And I have Shiplu Miah, who is from MEND, who sort of monitor and give a platform, if you like, on how to deal with Islamophobia or things that affect the Muslim community. They were previously called Engage, so they were encouraging the Muslim community to sort of get together, be more proactive. If they are victimized, if there's laws that's specifically addressing with them, then obviously those things need to be addressed. So, MEND, or previously known as iEngage, were doing that, and I'm going to ask him a few questions, inshallah, later on to give us more information. But I'd like to start with Wajahat, if I may. Thank you very much for coming on the show today. Now, the CTS bill, there's been sort of messages going around saying it's going to affect the Muslims quite a bit. Most of us are not lawyers. I mean, what does it mean? What is it about?
CTS bill, the Counter-Terrorism Security Bill, just to give you a general, very basic snapshot of it. Why are the government introducing this piece of legislation? It seems like a very basic and crude way of dealing with the rise of the Islamic State, the existence of the Islamic State, what they see as the rise of extremism in this country, and extremism has a particular definition, but also the problem of British citizens from this country going abroad to Syria to fight, and the possibility and problem of them returning to this country and how to deal with that. It deals with it in a number of ways, dealing with the problems of people going out. It's introducing laws to seize passports. People who are regarded by the state as involved in terrorism or terrorist-related activity, they will have their passports seized. It can be at the airport, it can be at other places. The problem of returnees, young men, usually young men from Syria coming back, the law is going to introduce temporary exclusion orders, exclusion of suspected terrorists. They can return, they have to follow specific guidelines and rules to get back into the country, and it's controlled by the state, by the Home Secretary.
So does that mean at the port of entry, be it the airport or the seaport, they'll be taken to a private room, they'll be questioned, and sort of, will they have like a selection process? Or
the mechanics of all of this is all rather vague.
It is still a bill.
The gist of the law, it's still a bill.
It hasn't become law, so we won't see it in practice for some time.
That's correct.
Perhaps.
It's not law. The law is imminent, could be a matter of weeks or months. But the bill presents the law in outline as how the government wants to present it, to legislate it.
So it's a proposed law to be debated in
Absolutely.
the House of Commons or House of Lords.
But it's very advanced. So if it will become law, and the general view, the view of the politicians, public opinion, it's encountered some resistance, but on the whole, very little meaningful resistance. So we've covered seizure of passports, temporary exclusion. There are all requirements on those businesses, those individuals, those organizations and companies that were called carriers, for example, airlines, boats, trains, ferries and the like, to provide information on who's on board their vehicle, passengers and crew members.
But they do that already, don't they? So that's nothing new.
They do that already, but I think this is going to be a lot more involved, possibly even providing copies of passports, passport numbers, and if you consider the international dimension, there's a lot of data being collected, and it probably will involve this government being able to liaise with other governments, other law enforcement agencies around the world to check up on individuals. I think that the final and perhaps the most important area where it could affect the Muslim community is two aspects: preventing people being drawn into terrorism and supporting individuals who are identified by the police as vulnerable to being drawn into terrorism. So this is the final aspect. That deals with the creation of homegrown terrorists to try and prevent that. Measures in place compelling local authorities, government bodies. When I mean local authorities, it will involve schools, hospitals, social services.
So those frontline services now become
Absolutely.
the eyes and the ears of the security services?
Well, there are bodies which are going to be set up in place that will be required to take positive measures to try and draw people away from extremism, and there's also a sharing of information element. So data is being collected on individuals, and if individuals are identified, the second aspect, identifying individuals who are vulnerable to extremism and, to put it simply, de-radicalizing them.
Okay, I'll come to you for more on this one. We're talking about communities, we're talking about identifying individuals. MEND is actually trying to encourage the Muslim community particularly to be aware of the law and how to deal with it. Yeah. So going on from what Wajahat said, would you say there's an increase in sort of the use of the law and also the Muslim awareness, or are Muslims still oblivious to what's happening around them?
I mean, I don't think it's just the Muslim community. I think generally the public are quite unaware of this bill, the provisions within this bill, and how it can impact not just Muslim community but the wider community. And it's not helped by the fact that the political establishment as well as the media aren't focusing on this. So we have many debates and taking place around many other issues in the political spectrum, but not much attention is being put on this. So it's not just the Muslim community but the wider community. I don't actually have an idea what this bill actually means.
Again, excuse my ignorance on this one a little bit, but you know, when it comes to terrorism, when it comes to sort of applying and de-radicalizing, I have not come across an example which doesn't involve Muslims. I mean, have you come across any non-Muslim example where someone was de-radicalized or? Well,
it depends what we mean by radicalizing as well, extremism, radicalization, all of this. I mean, it can be argued that elements of that exist in the far right, in the likes of EDOA and so forth.
But they have existing laws, they need not call it terrorism.
No, exactly, and so the question comes in, do we actually need this particular law? And arguably we don't actually need this sort of law to actually be
and Wajahat was saying that perhaps the Islamic State or what's happening in Syria and Iraq has actually given the impetus for the government to come forward to address those issues. Would you say that is the case, or they were going to make things, tighten things even more?
But it's ironic that every time we have a so-called attack on, as they would put it, as the political establishment, sometimes the media would put it, an attack on our freedom, it's ironic then that we enact laws that actually restrict our freedom. So if there's anything that this does, is just restricts our freedom furthermore and plays into the hands of the terrorists, presumably targeting us for our freedom. So it's very ironic and it's counterproductive.
Of course, laws are not made, I mean, they're made for everybody, but it only affects a small portion.
Yeah, exactly.
And so the government could argue that we are legislating to take away civil liberties, to take away certain rights and freedoms from a small number to protect the
that's not
community.
What they're arguing, though. They're saying this is for the general public, for everyone, and they say it's not targeted towards Muslim. But if Schedule 7 or even the stop and search powers that the police have, if they're anything to go by, then research clearly shows that those were used disproportionately towards black and ethnic minority groups, and certainly when it comes to Schedule 7 towards the Muslim communities.
Wajahat, I know you attended some discussions on Schedule 7 over the weekend.
Yeah.
Would you say the Muslims are particularly of interest when it comes to Schedule 7, or is it a general law? I mean, they don't actually legislate just for Muslims. They use generalistic terms, don't they?
Yeah, just to explain Schedule 7 for those who aren't familiar with what it means. It's the ability to, for generally police officers at ports, airports, seaports, to stop an individual, person who's travelling or who could be in the premises, vicinity of a port, to determine whether they're involved in the commission, preparation or instigation of acts of terrorism. My experience is that it predominantly affects Muslims. You could call it a Muslim law, a law aimed at Muslims. And
I think also the numbers being floated was something like 40,000 a year.
That's correct.
So it's not, you know, tens or in the hundreds. We're
No,
talking
about
thousands of people being subjected to perhaps intimidating and degrading behavior. I mean, you know, you're trying to go on holiday or you're trying to come back, you've got other things on your mind.
Absolutely.
And then you have somebody taking you to a room and wasting your time, not necessarily wasting, but consuming your time and alleging things which you may not agree with.
But my experience is that it's an unwelcome intrusion into your travel plans. On the whole, the officers are fairly polite and professional, but they do ask some very precise and personal questions. They want to know about your life. They want to know who you are, where you're from, who your relatives are, your background, your education. And where it gets, shall we say, becomes an issue is when they start questioning, requesting your views on certain things. Your views on the war in Iraq, your views on the war in Afghanistan, your views on Al-Qaeda.
So your sort of acceptability of the foreign policy of the state, or what are they looking for when they ask these questions?
Well, in my opinion, it's a filtering exercise. It's a screening exercise.
So they want to see if you're passive or you oppose the general sort of politics. Are you involved in politics? I mean, are they trying to ascertain your, how can I put it, your opposition to their policies?
That's an element of it, to ascertain your views, whether you hold views that could be regarded or defined as extreme, extreme being anti-democratic, against the rule of law, against democracy, against equality for all citizens, such as men, women, gays, lesbians, etc.
Okay.
Those kind of
we'll
issues.
come more onto that one. Shiplu, have you spoken to anyone who's actually gone through that process? Where they've been
Schedule 7.
When they've been stopped.
Yeah,
I mean, we're talking about the bill for the future, but obviously in terms of practicality.
Exactly. When it comes to practicality and how these laws are implemented, as I mentioned, Schedule 7 is, if anything's to go by, then it was predominantly used towards Muslims, and I know many cases that relate to friends of mine who've been stopped under Schedule 7 and kept in airports for up to 9 hours, where they've missed their flight and effectively ruined their holidays, and there is no compensation either. There's no recourse to gain your money back or the damages done because of that. And on many cases, they've just asked you these questions and let you go.
Of course, there has to be a balance between the sort of, if you like, the police doing their job to protect the greater population and individuals' rights. Now, if it has lasted 9 hours and they have missed their flights, if I can come to Wajahat, you're a criminal lawyer.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, if you're taken through the criminal process and you're acquitted, tough. You still have your freedom, but they have taken you through the process.
Yes.
I mean, is there anything you can do about that generally in criminal law?
Well,
because I know if you have suffered financial loss or you've incurred expenses, you may be able to recover your costs.
We're talking about...
but there's no compensation for loss of time or liberty?
No, because an investigation takes place, the police conduct an investigation, they arrest you, they put questions to you in interview, they then subsequently charge you. The charging decision is made by a CPS lawyer because, and the criteria is, there is sufficient evidence to secure a successful conviction, and it's only on that assessment that you are charged. If you are acquitted as a result of that, that doesn't change the original prosecutor's assessment.
So if they were correct in reaching the original decision,
yes,
then there is no remedy in terms of your losses?
You can't even recover legal costs now.
I see.
Whereas
I see.
a judge could order costs, you can't recover.
So
those
if
costs
they
now.
didn't follow the procedure or they had incorrectly judged that, there may be some room to recover.
If you can establish bad faith, if you can...
So are we talking malicious prosecution? Are we hinting towards that?
We're going into those areas, and there are different tests, different laws, different standards to be applied. But it is quite difficult because you're trying to get evidence and information from those who have conducted proceedings against you. And they're generally very tactical and very deliberate in what they disclose or do not disclose.
Okay. I want to ask both of you, and you can jump in whenever you like. Is there a distinction between what is deemed as extreme views and what is deemed as a terrorist risk or threat? For example, generally it is known that in Islam you don't believe in certain types of relationships. In Islam, you have a duty to submit to Allah wholeheartedly. Now, there may be an inherent, if you like, competition between that and allowing majority to prevail or allow any sort of relationship to be, expressed in public. Over the years, we've seen certain types of relationships being allowed and sometimes even celebrated. And if you don't participate in those celebrations, you're seen as somewhat not going with the status quo. Is there a distinction being made between not necessarily participating and engaging yourself in, is there a distinction between holding extreme views and seen as a terrorist threat? Because you could be extreme in the sense that you don't follow the general view, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're a threat to the general public.
I don't know.
Wajahat might be in a better position.
He might be able to answer in terms of legally, but in terms of actual in practice, there is no definition of what extremism is and how that. And obviously we can understand what terrorist activities are, especially if it's very obvious, such as an attack. But extremism and views that we declare as extreme, I don't think there is a definition on that, and that's what makes it very difficult and very dangerous when you have bills like this that is left to people such as public officials, such as the police, such as border officials, to determine what they understand to be extreme, and what they understand to be extreme might be different from what I understand to be extreme, might be even different from what a judge understands to be extreme. And that's what makes this sort of legislation very dangerous, because it leaves up to an individual's arbitrary understanding of what extremism is and is not, to then use that to determine if someone's suspicious, and then allow them to use the powers that they've been given because of laws like this.
Right, okay.
Can I just follow on that point? Shiplu's correct, there is no legal definition of extremism. There is a definition, it's very difficult to find within the PREVENT documentation. And extremism...
Sorry, what is PREVENT documentation?
Is part of the government's strategy to counter extremism, terrorist extremism.
So in that document they try to define what extremism is?
In the documentation,
okay.
It's a policy to counter terrorism and extremism. And in the documentation, you have to hunt for it. Extremism has been defined as being against democracy, against the rule of law, against equality, equal treatment, for example, of men and women. So giving your example of certain issues, let's say, as a Muslim, we accept that Allah has the right to determine the laws and rules, and we follow those laws and rules. According to the PREVENT definition of extremism, I would be an extremist because I do not believe in the rule of English law or British law. I'm following the laws of Allah, Sharia law.
But there isn't, there need not be an inherent conflict. I think where there is a conflict, that's where it becomes important.
Absolutely.
A lot of it, goes side by side.
99% of the time, Muslims living in this country don't have any issues or conduct their lives without having any tension with English law. There may be the occasions where they do. They may express
there's been
certain views.
there has been, some scholars have said, and I'm talking about legal scholars, not Muslim scholars. The principles of English law is actually taken from the Muslim administration in Sicily. So even English law perhaps has some roots in Sharia principles. I just want to ask both of you, is there a definition for terrorism? Because it's used quite often. I mean, is there a particular definition?
Yes, there is. In the criminal law, there's a definition of terrorism, and simply putting it very plainly, it relates to the use or threat of violence against a section of the public or government body for a political or ideological cause.
Right. So using violence to advance your political agenda.
Absolutely. That's a very basic, the gist of the definition of terrorism.
Okay. If I can come to Shiplu, doesn't the British government around the world actually use perhaps persuasive powers, finances, foreign interventions to promote their ideals?
I guess you can understand that definition to include activities that are sanctioned by the state, and you can call it state terrorism.
I mean, the famous example is changing the government in Iraq. Removing Saddam Hussein is a political change, and they use physical
sure it can
force
be
to
argued
do that.
as that, but there's definition, there's what we can understand from, and there's actual practice of it. And in practice, what's understood to be terrorism, unfortunately, is only is when it relates to Muslims, Muslim individuals, not even Muslim states. Muslim individuals, and we see this when we saw Anders Breivik killing in Norway. The media didn't call him to be a terrorist. They called him all sorts of names, but they didn't use the term terrorist. And so in practice, terrorism is almost reserved for Muslims.
Okay. Wajahat, if I can ask you, so if they have decided to, extremism, terrorism, they're bringing this new bill, and if it becomes law, it's going to affect a small portion of the Muslim population. I mean, how many people go out to Syria and try to come back? We're talking hundreds. So why should the viewers really take,
Well,
I mean, it wouldn't affect them, right?
You have to look at this bill in conjunction with all the other provisions that they have in place. You can't look at it in isolation. That's one point. I think the really sinister and perhaps the darker and murkier aspect of this bill relates to preventing people being drawn into terrorism and the measures that they're trying to put into place to identify people who are vulnerable to extremism. And from my experience, having dealt with the police and having dealings with security services, they already have a fairly mature and established network of intelligence sources and intelligence capabilities. This is taking it to another level. For example, a very basic example, I've dealt with many young men who are arrested, charged, or even questioned under the terrorism provisions or Schedule 7. They become of interest to the police and security services, but it's not just the young men themselves, it's their families who also become of interest. So you could have social services intervention to see whether the children of these young men are being brought up properly, schools intervening to see what kind of views they have, what they're saying in class. So these kind of issues, these kind of provisions have a wider and far-reaching consequence and impact.
So it has knock-on effect on other members. And also, if we go by the 40,000, I think is the figure floated for last year,
yes,
who were at the port sort of asked questions in relation to ascertaining whether they're a threat or not. It's a large number because you have 40,000.
Yes.
And I know people who, they get the interview, when they go home, they speak to their friends and family. So it sort of spreads, and there is this, would you say there is an element of intimidation and a bit of fear-mongering?
That's one aspect to it. The other aspect is data collection, retention and profiling.
That's interesting. What data can they collect if you're just going on a holiday?
Well, when you undertake the Schedule 7 process at the airport, there is a standard set of questions that the individual
sorry, I
stopped.
understand there is like 3 steps they have to follow. What are the three?
Well,
three phases.
Well, it's rather a grey area where there's 3 stages. My experience is that often individuals are targeted. The state, the authorities try to say that it's selection on the day, but of the individuals who I often represent, they know they're going to get stopped, and they are stopped. So they call me in advance to say, I'm travelling on this flight, or I'm arriving at this port. I know I'm going to get stopped, just be on standby. But The purpose of the stop is to get information from you. Information, personal information, information about what you're doing, what your views are, where you've been, why you've been there. But most importantly, to get access to your phones, your computers, any other documentation you're carrying, and make copies of that on your phones. We all have smartphones.
That's surely infringement of civil liberties.
It's the law. They can do that.
I mean, from a Muslim perspective, you may have pictures of your wife or your daughters.
Absolutely.
Or you may have other things on there which are not necessarily criminal, but they are personal.
Well, Saleh, you're a lawyer.
You wouldn't want that in the private domain. So.
You're a lawyer. You're taking your computer on a flight. You get stopped under Schedule 7. You've got privileged documentation and communication on there. They say they won't take it. They will image your hard drive. They will have a copy of it.
Okay, so from your experience, because I think there was a case where a parliamentarian went to visit a terrorism suspect in prison, and they were keeping recordings of that when they're not supposed to.
Yes.
So if that happens, one could guess and say, well, if your hard drive is copied, it could end up in the wrong hands, could it not?
Yes. I think the main point from all of this is, are we as Muslims comfortable with the state having so much access to our personal and private information? Are we comfortable with it? I personally don't have that confidence in the state. I don't have that faith in the state to deal with Muslims objectively and fairly.
Okay, if I may go to Shiplu.
So just on that point, and we talk about the number 40,000, but that doesn't show how many thousands of people are put off from traveling. I know many people who are put off from traveling because just in case they lose their flight, where they lose their money, or just in case that they are stopped and harassed.
It introduces uncertainty.
Exactly. So that goes, that goes unnoticed. Then thousands of people who are actually affected by it. It's not just the 40,000 who actually experience the powers of Schedule 7, but all those family, friends, and so forth that are put off from traveling.
But,
right.
Okay, there are things that can be done to moderate that, to kind of deal with their fears and anxieties beforehand. It can be done, it can be managed, shall we say.
Okay. You're saying most of the people interviewed, they're young, so we're talking about, 18 to 30 years old. The office is doing the work if they're sufficiently trained, if they have the experience, they're going to be 30 plus. And usually it's sort of 2 officers that approach you.
Yes.
So that whole process itself is quite intimidating.
Well,
so viewers watching, if they're thinking of traveling to, say, North Africa or Middle East, what can they do to prepare themselves mentally, if you like?
Well, there are a number of things they can do. Firstly, if they know there are a candidate who is likely to be stopped, I would suggest...
So say someone works for the charities and they link with, mix with different people, and because I've sort of heard if you work for charity or if you work in the public domain,
yes,
then you become more of an interest to be stopped.
You do. I've been stopped under Schedule 7 going with an aid convoy to Syria. You are more of a target if you work, if you're part of a particular organisation such as charities, if you come from certain areas in Britain where you have a large Muslim population, if you're travelling to certain destinations, particularly, let's say, the United States, North America, parts of the Muslim world, more likely than not, you will get stopped. You can prepare for that. I suggest you have, in bullet point format, a brief biography of yourself, just for yourself, to focus on how you're going to answer the questions. Secondly, take a pen and paper along, make a note of the questions that you've been asked and the answers that you've given. This is for future reference, because if you're stopped once, you probably will get stopped again. You can say, well, I was stopped on such and such date. These are the answers that I gave. You're welcome to a copy of the answers. Nothing's changed in my life, really. Yeah, if you're interested. Thirdly, don't take any computers, smartphones, or anything that contains personal information such that the state can copy and keep a record of it. Fourthly, have the details of a lawyer at hand if you are uncomfortable at any stage, or if you need, more importantly, a witness present during the interviewing process to keep a separate and independent record of what's taken place. Call the lawyer.
Okay. In terms of calling a lawyer, if I may ask, what parts of the process are you allowed to oppose or say, look, I'm not participating in this? Or do you have to go through all of that?
Well,
Because
it's
if you're a traveler,
offense.
someone, officer approaches you, shows
Yes.
you their badge and says, right, come with me.
Yeah.
Can you just say, look, I'm running late for my flight, I'll see you on the way back?
Well,
Can you
it's
say
a
that?
criminal offence not to answer the questions. If you avoid the process, there is a separate offence being committed and you could get charged. But it's a criminal offence to avoid answering the questions. The point at which you should call a lawyer is when you're taken away for questioning or the examination process.
Okay.
My understanding is that they don't have to wait for the lawyer to arrive before starting the questioning. Is that correct?
They can say that. My experience is when I've spoken to the Schedule 7 examining officers is say, I'm going to arrive there in 30 minutes. I suggest you wait for me. It's not going to really take that much time away from your examination. And generally they're quite respectful and they do wait.
Can you say no comment? I mean, is that right available?
The offence is not to answer their questions, but instead of saying no comment, if you're unsure of anything, if you're uncertain or you don't have a view or an opinion on a particular matter, let's say you don't have a view or opinion on ISIS, just say, look, I don't have a view.
So if they ask you, do you pray 5 times a day? Could you turn around and say, I don't really keep count? I mean, would that, that work?
You have to be sensible. Some of these questions are fairly uncontroversial. They're fairly inconsequential as well, aren't they?
I think there are some Muslim countries in the world where if you pray 5 times a day, you're regarded as being fairly extreme and devout.
And you call them Muslim countries.
Of course.
Yeah,
So if they ask you, do you pray 5 times a day? And you say yes, and then they say, well, you're very devout, are you not?
Some would say I am, some would say I'm not.
I see. Shiplu,
from your practice, someone has to almost become a lawyer to answer those kind of questions in a smart way.
That's why I suggest beforehand, the purpose, and this is what you've got to focus on, the purpose of the Schedule 7 interview is to determine whether you're involved in commission, preparation or instigation of acts of terrorism, whether you're a terrorist.
But most of the viewers, they wouldn't know what is regarded and what isn't regarded. And perhaps they wouldn't necessarily know when to speak, when not to speak.
And I appreciate that. And the definition of terrorism is the use or threat of violence. Would you use or threaten violence for your faith? And the answer is no. So it's if someone was to ask you the direct question, would you use or threaten violence for your faith? You'd say no, you're not a terrorist by definition, are you?
I see.
You could potentially be an extremist because you're against democracy, the rule of law, which is another thing. And the problem with this Schedule 7 process is that they identify individuals who are extreme for further processing through the de-radicalization programs, or they identify individuals who could be approached by security services for intelligence purposes.
I see. So they're gathering information.
Absolutely.
A person of interest. Okay. I'm going to ask you both as to what things are there to safeguard. So, for example, let's say a Muslim was suffering from, I don't know, some sort of mental disorder, someone who had, they were susceptible to certain ideas, they didn't understand the language well. Because, of course, not everyone is educated to the full level, not everyone is mentally 100%. So when you're under stress, you may say certain things. So we're going to go to a break, inshallah, and when we come back, we'll discuss these issues. Viewers at home, if you have your own opinions and thoughts, inshallah, you may have an opportunity to participate as well. I have 2 guests. We're discussing criminal matters and terrorism. So inshallah, do stay tuned. I'll see you on the other side of the break. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.